Welcome back, everyone. I know this deep dive comes after a really momentous event. The 2024 election is officially done. Trump's back in the White House.
Wow.
And I imagine you're feeling all kinds of things right now. Probably some shock and maybe some disappointment, too. And we're right there with you.
Definitely.
But, instead of just dwelling on what happened, we wanted to try to understand the why.
Yeah,
So we've got two interesting pieces of analysis we're going to unpack today.
that's right. We've got Jen Rubin's post-election message from her green room,
Okay.
and we've also got Ezra Klein's podcast episode, What Does This Leave Democrats With? Where he's talking with Claire Gordon.
I see.
So,
And this is where it gets interesting. Both Rubin and Klein are definitely coming from the left.
yeah,
But they actually offer some really different takes on what led to this outcome and what it means going forward.
absolutely. And one of the things that both sources highlight right off the bat is this sense of just disbelief, almost shock at the results.
Yeah, considering all of the controversies and the legal baggage that Trump's been carrying, it definitely threw a lot of people for a loop.
Yeah.
It seems like even some folks who were really critical of him ended up voting for him anyway.
Right. And Rubin even makes this point, we have to respect voters' choices even if we don't agree with them.
Mm.
Americans knew all about Trump's flaws and they chose him anyway.
Yeah.
That suggests there's something much deeper going on.
It's like there's a disconnect between focusing on, Trump's negatives
Right.
and actually trying to understand what's really driving those voters.
Exactly. And on the other hand, Klein's pointing out that Democrats just failed to convince enough voters that Trump was fundamentally unfit for office.
Yeah.
And, given his past actions, that's kind of a head-scratcher.
Really makes you think about whether the Democrats' message really resonated with people.
Yeah.
Were they too focused on Trump's personality instead of offering a clear and hopeful alternative?
That's a key question. Now, let's look at the economic side of things.
Hmm.
Rubin pretty much dismisses the idea that the economy was the main reason people voted for Trump.
Okay.
She points to Biden's achievements in terms of economic recovery.
So on the surface, it might seem like the economy was actually doing okay under Biden.
Right.
But Klein digs a little deeper. He connects this election to a much bigger global trend.
Yeah.
We're seeing this anti-incumbent sentiment pretty much everywhere, fueled by the post-pandemic economy and inflation.
It's not just about abstract economic indicators.
Yeah.
People are really feeling the pinch in their daily lives.
Yeah.
Klein highlights the rising cost of things like gas and groceries and all those other essentials
Right.
as major contributors to this sense of dissatisfaction with the status quo.
So while Rubin might be right about the Biden administration's economic record, it sounds like voters were actually more focused on what was happening to their wallets than the bigger picture.
Exactly. It's the difference between statistics and lived experience.
That's a good point. Now, Rubin brings up a point that I found really thought-provoking.
Oh, yeah.
She wonders if misogyny played a role in how voters perceived Kamala Harris's campaign, even though she had a really strong run.
What's fascinating is that Rubin points to Harris's approval ratings, which were higher than Biden's, which is really unusual for a vice president.
Right. It makes you wonder if there were other factors at play that went beyond just her campaign performance.
Definitely.
What if those societal biases, particularly against women in positions of power, influenced how some voters saw her?
It's something worth considering. It's not the first time we've seen qualified women face an uphill battle in politics.
Definitely not. This is where Klein's analysis gets really interesting. He draws a parallel between this election and the 2004 election where George W. Bush won a second term, despite all the criticism about the Iraq War.
Right. He's suggesting there's the pattern here,
Yeah.
He argues that in both cases, the opposing party just failed to really challenge the incumbent and offer a compelling alternative vision. Voters might have had their doubts, but they just weren't convinced enough to actually switch sides.
So it's not enough to just point out the flaws of the person in office.
Right.
You have to give people a reason to vote for something else.
You need a vision.
A vision for the future that they can get excited about.
Exactly. And that's where both sources seem to agree that Biden's age played a significant role.
Okay, so this is a sensitive topic, but let's be real.
Yeah.
Biden at 80, with his approval ratings being what they were, wasn't exactly the picture of youthful energy.
Right.
And Klein is pretty blunt about it. He says Biden shouldn't have run for re-election.
Wow.
He thinks a younger candidate might have had a better shot.
That's a bold statement, but it raises a really important question. At what point does age become a legitimate factor in voters' minds?
Yeah.
even if a candidate is experienced and qualified.
Even though Rubin acknowledges the age factor, she also tries to defend Harris's campaign. She points out that Harris had to step into the race late, inheriting all the baggage of the Biden administration, and didn't really have time to carve out her own path.
Right. It's true she faced a lot of constraints, but Klein's point is that she never really articulated a clear vision beyond just opposing Trump. It's like she was running against a ghost from the past
Yeah.
instead of presenting a tangible path forward.
So even if voters liked Harris, maybe they just weren't sure what she stood for, beyond being not Trump.
Right. And that lack of a clear, compelling narrative might have been a major hurdle for her.
Now, one thing that really stood out to me in both sources was the emphasis on engaging with Trump voters. Both Rubin and Klein seem to agree that just dismissing or writing them off is a total dead end.
Absolutely. And Klein uses this great phrase, curiosity over contempt.
I love that.
He argues that if Democrats actually want to win back those voters, they need to actually understand them. What are their motivations? What are their experiences? What are their fears and aspirations?
It's so easy to fall into the trap of, demonizing the other side.
Right.
But ultimately, understanding is the key to bridging the divide.
Absolutely.
But how do you actually do that? I mean, both Rubin and Klein are saying the Democrats need to change to adapt, but what does that even look like in practice?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting, and that's what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, I'm hooked. I can't wait.
Yeah.
All right, we'll be right back after a quick break.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's one thing to say adapt, but the real question is how, and both Rubin and Klein offer some concrete ideas.
Okay, I'm all ears, lay it on me.
So Rubin suggests that Democrats need to kind of go back to basics.
Okay.
Focus on building from the ground up at the state and local levels. She argues that demonstrating those tangible improvements in people's lives at that level can help rebuild trust and that, Democratic brand.
So it's about showing, not just telling.
Exactly. It's about delivering real results,
Yeah.
things that people can actually see and feel in their daily lives.
Yeah.
Think about things like, lowering healthcare costs, creating well-paying jobs, improving public schools.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Start where you can make a real difference and then build from there.
Right. But I also noticed that Rubin doesn't shy away from confrontation.
Oh.
She talks about holding Trump and his supporters accountable for the consequences of their choices. She even predicts things like mass deportations and the politicization of institutions like the FDA,
Wow.
arguing that people need to see the real-world impact of their votes.
That's a pretty stark picture.
It is. And Klein kind of echoes that sentiment, but in his own way. He talks about the immense power that Trump now wields with control of the Senate, the Supreme Court, and likely the House as well.
He doesn't sugarcoat it, does he?
Not at all.
Okay.
But here's where it gets really interesting. He actually compares this situation to the aftermath of the 2004 election.
Okay.
Remember, back then, a lot of Democrats thought that Bush's victory meant a permanent Republican takeover.
Oh, yeah, I remember that feeling of despair. But of course, that didn't happen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Things changed.
Yeah.
The reality of the Bush administration, the failures of the Iraq War, it all came to light, and it shifted the political landscape. And Klein is suggesting that we might be seeing a similar situation now.
So you're saying it's not necessarily game over?
Right. It's more like the beginning of a new chapter 1 that's full of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And Klein argues that Democrats need to kind of embrace that uncertainty, be open to new voices and ideas, and recognize that the old Obama coalition might not be enough anymore.
That's a pretty bold statement. Is he suggesting that the Democratic Party as we know it is over?
He doesn't say that outright, but he does call for a fundamental reassessment of the party's strategies and priorities. He thinks they need to be open to a wider range of perspectives and be willing to really listen to the concerns of voters who might not fit neatly into those traditional categories.
Okay, so big changes are needed. But what about Kamala Harris? We talked about the challenges she faced in this election. What do our sources have to say about her campaign going forward?
Well, both Klein and Gordon acknowledged that Harris had an incredibly tough job. Stepping in late, being tied to an unpopular administration, it was almost an impossible task.
It's like she was set up to fail.
In some ways, yes. But they also point out that she struggled to articulate a clear vision beyond simply opposing Trump. Remember that idea we talked about earlier? You need to give people something to vote FOR.
Right. A positive vision for the future.
Exactly. And Gordon suggests that while Harris is a skilled campaigner and debater, she didn't quite manage to create that compelling narrative. She was always going to be seen as a representative of the Biden administration, which kind of limited her ability to connect with voters on her own terms.
It's almost like she was trapped in Biden's shadow.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And it raises a really interesting what-if question.
Hmm.
What if Biden hadn't run? What if the Democrats had allowed for a more competitive primary process? Would a different candidate have emerged? Someone better suited to the current political landscape?
It's the ultimate hypothetical, but it does highlight the need for parties to be more adaptable, more open to fresh perspectives, especially in times of political upheaval.
Absolutely. And Klein is particularly critical of the Democratic Party's reluctance to engage with certain segments of the electorate.
Okay.
He specifically mentions Joe Rogan's podcast, which has a huge audience.
Oh, yeah, I remember he caught some flack for even suggesting that Bernie Sanders was right to appear on Rogan's show back in 2020.
Exactly.
Mm.
And now, just a few years later, Rogan's platform has become a major space for right-wing figures like Elon Musk to spread their message. And Klein argues that this refusal to engage, to be curious about different perspectives, ultimately hurt the Democrats.
It's that curiosity over contempt idea again. If you want to understand why people are drawn to figures like Trump or Musk, you have to be willing to engage with their ideas even if you vehemently disagree with them.
Precisely. And Klein's point is that by writing off entire segments of the population, by refusing to engage with their concerns and anxieties, the Democrats created a vacuum that others were all too happy to fill.
It's a cautionary tale for sure. So if the Democrats need to engage more with figures like Rogan and Musk, does that mean they also need to adopt some of their views? I mean, some of their ideas are pretty out there.
That's a great question, and it goes to the heart of what both Rubin and Klein are getting at. It's not about mimicking the other side. It's about understanding where they're coming from, what needs and desires they're tapping into, and figuring out how to connect with those voters on their own terms.
So it's more about understanding the cultural landscape than about specific policies.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that there's a cultural disconnect that needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
And that's something we'll be exploring in more detail in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've talked about the need for change for Democrats to adapt to this new political landscape, but what does that actually look like when it comes to this cultural disconnect?
Well, Klein uses this really interesting analogy. He compares the current political landscape to a Venn diagram with these two overlapping circles.
Okay, I'm visualizing it.
So one circle represents that cultural space where a lot of voters are spending their time, particularly men. Think about the podcasts they're listening to, the online communities they're engaging with.
Mm-hmm.
The other circle represents the space where the Democrats are operating their policies, their overall vibe.
Okay.
And I'm guessing there's not a whole lot of overlap between those two circles.
Yeah, probably not.
Exactly. Klein argues that the Democrats need to figure out how to bridge that gap if they want to connect with those voters. They need to understand the cultural forces that are shaping their worldviews.
So it's not just about having the right policies. It's about understanding the cultural context in which those policies are being received.
Precisely. It's about speaking the same language, tapping into the same anxieties and aspirations, and framing your message in a way that resonates with that audience.
Okay, so how do Democrats actually do that? How do they bridge that cultural divide without compromising their values?
Well, this is where things get really interesting, and where both Rubin and Klein offer some potentially controversial ideas. Rubin, for example, suggests that Democrats need to be willing to challenge some of their own sacred cows.
What do you mean?
Well, she argues that the Democrats have become too focused on identity politics, and that this has alienated some voters who feel like their concerns aren't being heard.
So she's saying they need to broaden their appeal, move away from focusing solely on specific identity groups.
Exactly. She thinks Democrats need to find a way to articulate a message that speaks to a broader set of values, a message that can unite people across lines of race, gender, and sexual orientation.
That sounds like a tall order. How do you appeal to everyone without alienating anyone?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that the Democrats are going to have to grapple with in the coming years. Klein, on the other hand, suggests that the Democrats need to be more willing to embrace a certain level of discomfort.
Discomfort? What do you mean by that?
Well, he argues that the Democrats have become too risk-averse, too afraid of offending anyone, that they've lost their edge.
So they need to be more willing to take risks to challenge conventional thinking.
Exactly. He thinks they need to be more willing to have difficult conversations, to engage with people who hold different views, and to be open to the possibility that they might learn something along the way.
It's about being willing to step outside their comfort zone to have those tough conversations that might lead to real change.
Right. And it's about recognizing that growth and progress often come from discomfort, from being willing to challenge our own assumptions and biases.
It sounds like both Rubin and Klein are calling for a pretty fundamental shift in how the Democrats operate.
Absolutely. It's not just about tweaking their messaging or adopting a few new policies. It's about a deeper change in mindset, a willingness to re-examine their core beliefs and assumptions about how to win elections and govern effectively.
So it's about more than just winning back the White House. It's about redefining what it means to be a Democrat in this new political landscape.
Exactly. It's about figuring out how to be both principled and pragmatic, how to stand up for your values while also being able to connect with voters who might not share all of those values.
It's about finding that sweet spot between conviction and compromise.
Right. And it's about recognizing that the political landscape is constantly shifting and that to succeed, you need to be willing to adapt, evolve, and even reinvent yourself.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you hope listeners will walk away with?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's important to recognize that this election was about more than just Trump. It was about a confluence of factors, a perfect storm of economic anxieties, cultural shifts, and political missteps.
It wasn't just one thing, it was a whole bunch of things coming together at the same time.
Exactly. And I think it's also important to remember that this isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning of a new chapter one that's full of uncertainty and possibility.
We're at a turning point in American politics, and how this next chapter unfolds depends on how we all respond to the challenges ahead.
Precisely. And I think the key to navigating these challenges lies in embracing curiosity over contempt, in being willing to listen to those who hold different views, and in recognizing that even in our differences, there's still a shared humanity that binds us together.
Beautifully said. So, to our listener, I want to leave you with this final thought. Both Rubin and Klein have challenged us to engage with this new reality with curiosity and a willingness to understand those who voted differently. Take some time to reflect on that challenge. What does it mean for you? How can you apply that in your own life? How can you contribute to creating a more inclusive and understanding political landscape?
Yeah, those are great questions. And they remind us that the work of democracy is never truly finished. It requires constant engagement, critical thinking, and a willingness to embrace the complexities of our world.
Well said. On that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.